Hey everyone, welcome in. Before we dive into the beautiful mess that was being a kid in ancient Rome, do me a solid. If you're into this kind of deep dive into the weird, wild past, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how far this stuff travels. So, let's set the scene. You're a teenager, but not now. We're talking ancient Rome. A place where they looked at your 13th birthday and said, "All right, kid, time to be an adult. Hope you like responsibility and heavy sheets." Your day doesn't start with a gentle alarm. No, Rome declares war on silence every single morning, and your sleep is the first casualty. Before the sun's even up, you're jarred awake by the city's greatest hits. The number one track? Your neighbor having a full-volume screaming match with his mule. The mule is arguing back, by the way. It's a debate happening on cobblestones at dawn, and you're just a prisoner in your own bed, listening to it all. You haven't even opened your eyes yet, but you already know what kind of day it's going to be. A Roman day, which means chaotic, loud, and probably a little disappointing. If your family has money, you wake up in a villa so nice it would make a god jealous. Marble floors, fancy mosaics, the whole deal. But that beautiful open-air design? It means your house is basically a wind tunnel with expensive decorations. A servant taps you awake, whispering, "Young master, it is time." What they really mean is, please get up before that rooster starts his solo concert again. If your family isn't rolling in denarii, your wake-up call is different. You share a room with what feels like a million siblings. Your mattress isn't memory foam. It's a pile of straw. And you know it's morning because your little brother just rolled off his side and landed right on your face. Outside, the rooster is screaming, the neighbor is already in a heated debate about the price of bread. And for a second, you consider inventing the modern door just to get 5 minutes of peace. Then the smell hits you. Welcome to the signature scent of Rome. It's a wild mix of baking bread, olive oil, temple incense with smoke, a whole lot of human sweat, and something else. That something else is usually the mystery liquid your upstairs neighbor decided to toss out their window last night. Privacy? Never heard of it. Quiet? She moved out years ago. Your feet hit the floor. Cold terracotta tiles if you're rich. Cold, hard-packed dirt if you're not. Either way, it's a shock that makes you question every life choice that led you to this moment. You stumble through your dark home, a maze of random stuff. Clay jugs, wicker baskets, stray sandals, your dad's tools. You'll inevitably trip over the family cat, who refuses to move because in its mind, it's a tiny, furry emperor. And just when you think it can't get any louder, Rome cranks the volume to 11. Vendors are shouting about fresh fruit. Bakers are yelling about their bread like they just won a military victory. Kids are tearing through the streets like they've had 10 cups of espresso. This is your morning alarm. This is Rome. A city that doesn't gently ask you to wake up. It grabs you by your tunic, shakes you, and says, "Rise, shine, survive." So you're up. You've survived the morning symphony of yelling and animal arguments. Now it's time for the most important meal of the day. Except in Rome, important is a strong word. Breakfast here isn't a meal. It's a suggestion. A tiny, edible whisper meant to stop your stomach from officially filing a complaint with the gods. You shuffle into the main room, half asleep and already a little annoyed at the world. Outside, the city is roaring. Inside, your family is assembling the saddest little feast you've ever seen. They call it ientaculum. You'll call it disappointment on a plate. If your family has cash, your spread might look fancy. A little bread dipped in honey, some dried figs, a few olives, maybe a chunk of cheese. It's the kind of snack platter a rich uncle calls light and elegant, when really it's just a bunch of small, salty things that barely count as food. Slaves bring it out, wearing the expression of people who know you're going to complain no matter what they put in front of you. If your family is like most Romans, your breakfast is much, much simpler. Bread. Just bread. And not the fluffy, warm kind. We're talking yesterday's bread. The kind of bread that, if you threw it at someone, could cause serious emotional damage. You might try to soften it up by dunking it in some watered-down wine. That's the Roman life hack. But let's be real, it just tastes like regret with a faint aftertaste of grape. And speaking of wine, yeah, you drink it in the morning. Not to get a buzz before math class, but because the water in Rome has the personality of a questionable pond. Drinking it straight is basically an adventure sport. So the teenagers of Rome drink watered wine and call it hydration. Meanwhile, 2,000 years later, parents are freaking out if their kid has too much caffeine. Times change, I guess. The family gathers around. The table is basically a plank of wood pretending to be furniture. Your dad is already deep into a rant about politics, taxes, or that neighbor who looked at him funny last week. Your mom is mentally planning the next 16 hours. Cleaning, shopping, rituals, and the full-time job of reminding you not to embarrass everyone in public. If you're a rich kid, you eat while a slave stands right there, holding your sandals, waiting to help you tie the complicated straps when you're done. If you're not rich, your mom chucks your sandals at you from across the room with the deadly accuracy of a trained archer. Then you go outside. The sad, beige smell of breakfast, bread and light disappointment, gets instantly replaced. The full, powerful aroma of Rome slams into you like a wall. Sizzling street meat, animal dung, someone yelling about fresh fish, someone else yelling that he's a liar, and a beggar having a heated argument with a pigeon. Breakfast is done. You have acquired your mysterious fuel. Rome is waiting for you, and it is already absolutely yelling at full volume. Alright, you're fed, you're dressed, sort of. Now Rome hits you with the big one. There's no such thing as a teenage phase here. No awkward, slow transition from kid to adult. Rome looked at 13-year-olds, shrugged, and said, "Congratulations. You now have the responsibilities of a 40-year-old senator, but with none of the salary or respect. Have fun. You don't grow into adulthood. You get shoved into it, like a soldier being tossed into the front line before he's even finished his morning porridge. And it all starts with a ceremony. One day you're a kid running around barefoot getting dirt everywhere. The next, you're being wrapped in the toga virilis. This is not a simple piece of clothing. It is a giant, heavy, overly dramatic bed sheet that signals to the world, "Hey, I'm a respectable adult now." The problem? Your brain is still firmly in the "do we have any snacks?" stage of development. Your whole family is there, beaming with pride. Your dad's patting your back. Your mom's crying a little. And you're just trying not to trip over this ridiculous fabric in front of half the city. Because if you do, you become the main character of Roman gossip for the next decade. If you're a girl, the expectations land even faster and harder. One morning you're playing with little clay dolls, and the next your mom sits you down and says, "Sweetheart, let's talk about marriage." You're 13. 13. That's the age when modern kids are struggling to pick a good profile picture. In Rome, it's the age you start planning a household, learning to manage money, and preparing to raise tiny humans who will one day yell political opinions in the street. Rome didn't believe in finding yourself. Rome believed in assigning you a self. You're the son of a baker? Great, you're gonna bake bread. You're the daughter of a merchant? Fantastic, you're learning accounting whether you like numbers or not. And Romans loved responsibility. They loved it so much they gave it to you before you could even spell the word. Boys were expected to prep for politics, master public speaking, and get ready for maybe joining the army. Girls learned to run a home, manage the finances, direct the servants, and, most importantly, avoid starting a scandal. In Rome, that was a full-time job all by itself. Everything you do is watched. Your posture, your manners, your grammar, your clothes, even the way you look at someone across the street. Rome is a city of professional gossipers. Everyone's a critic, and none of them are shy about it. Your hobbies are monitored. Reading? Good. Gambling? Bad. Staring at gladiators a little too long? Well, that depends on who saw you do it. Rome didn't wait for you to be ready. It demanded you be ready now, loudly, and in public. The pressure is on from day one. No wonder those statues look so stressed. If you're hooked on this story of ancient teenage pressure, make sure you're subscribed. The journey from kid to adult in Rome is just getting wilder. So you're a Roman teenage boy. Congratulations, you've graduated from tunics to the official uniform of manhood. I say uniform, but that's being generous. In practice, it's a heavy, impractical, uncooperative monster of a garment that seems specifically designed to make you eat dirt in public. The toga virilis. The first time you put it on, you finally understand why every single Roman statue has that slightly pained, constipated look on its face. It's not deep thought. It's the struggle of not tripping. The moment you step outside, the toga begins its secret mission to humiliate you. It slides off your shoulder, tangles around your legs like a lazy snake. A gentle breeze hits, and suddenly you're in a life-or-death wrestling match with a giant sheet. And if it so much as brushes the ground, instant filth. Rome is dusty, crowded, and full of mystery puddles you do not want on your nice white wool. But you wear it anyway, because it screams to the world, I am a man, even though you're still 13 and haven't figured out how to hold it without looking like you're fighting an invisible ghost. Now that you're officially a man in Roman society, again at 13, the fun really begins. Your responsibilities start piling up faster than empty wine cups at a festival. Your dad decides immediately that it's time for you to learn the important stuff. We're talking rhetoric, philosophy, law, military discipline, and the crucial art of greeting people in public without accidentally insulting their entire family line. And if you mess up, don't worry, someone will point it out. Loudly, probably your dad, maybe a random senator. The city itself will gossip about it. Your day now includes school, but forget quiet classrooms. Roman school happens outside, right in the middle of the chaos. Your classroom is the street. Your teacher, the literator, tries to recite great philosophers while ignoring the fishmonger yelling right behind him about the day's catch. You spend hours copying Greek passages, memorizing speeches, and practicing arguments. Romans loved arguing. They trained for it like it was an Olympic sport. You learn to debate everything. Politics, poetry, the best way to build an aqueduct, whether your friend's new haircut makes him look like a startled goat. All valid, serious topics. After school, you might follow your dad to the forum, the beating heart of the city. Here, you watch politics in action. Senators lying with total conviction. Merchants screaming about prices. Public speakers gesturing so wildly they almost knock over a bystander. Your dad whispers, "One day, this will be you." And you're thinking, one day, I hope I finally learn how to walk in this toga without needing a backup plan. You're also expected to be virtuous. Roman courage, Roman discipline. That means training your body, practicing with wooden swords, learning to march like a tiny, not very intimidating legionary. Being a Roman teen boy isn't relaxing. It's a marathon of expectations, and you're running it while wrapped in a very clumsy, very white blanket. Mastering the toga is the first of many battles. If you're enjoying this deep dive into ancient awkwardness, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more ridiculousness to come. Now, let's talk about the other half of the story. If you're a teenage girl in ancient Rome, your life doesn't gently ease into adulthood. It snaps into place, fast. One minute you're a kid, playing with dolls made from old wool scraps. The next, your mom sits you down and says, "All right, sweetheart, let's discuss household budgets and your future husband." While you're still trying to remember yesterday's lesson on how to spin flax into thread, your day starts early. I mean really early, before the sun even thinks about rising. Because according to Roman mothers, sunlight is optional, but productivity is mandatory. You wake up to the soundtrack of the city. Vendors, barking dogs, someone dropping a clay pot for the third morning in a row, and then to the sound of your mom's voice, reminding you that adulthood is not going to prepare itself. The work begins immediately. You're helping with weaving, spinning, cleaning, food prep, and the never-ending, soul-crushing cycle of Roman laundry. Roman clothes are mostly wool, and wool, when it's dirty, is your enemy. You're stirring vats of hot water, scrubbing mysterious stains, wringing out heavy tunics with your bare hands, and quietly wondering what you'd have to sacrifice to which god to invent the washing machine a few centuries early. If your family's wealthy, your day also includes supervising servants and learning how to host fancy dinners. Dinners where the guests will judge everything. The food, the wine, the seating chart, the conversation, the decorations, and probably the shape of your nose. Your mom teaches you how to smile politely while doing complex math in your head to stretch the household budget. She also teaches you the high-stakes art of avoiding scandal. In Rome, avoiding scandal is a competitive sport, and everyone's playing. If your family isn't rich, your workload doubles. You might be helping run the family stall at the market, carrying loads heavier than you are, bargaining with merchants who think they're comedy legends, and chasing your little siblings around before they accidentally set something on fire. And on top of all this, you're prepping for marriage. By 13 or 14, your parents are already scoping out potential husbands. Good family? Check. Has money? Even better. Breath smells like fermented fish? Unfortunate, but negotiable. Love? What's that? A Greek poem? A luxury for people who don't have to worry about olive oil supplies? Roman girls learned fast how to navigate a world built entirely by men who were sure they knew what was best. Your mom taught you the real secrets: how to negotiate, how to manage money on the down low, how to quietly run the entire household without any of the men noticing you're the one doing all the work. Your life is demanding, structured, chaotic, and endlessly busy, and you're only 13. Rome didn't give you time to grow up. It just looked at you and assumed you already had. Let's get one thing straight. School in ancient Rome was nothing like the quiet, orderly classrooms we picture today. No hallways, no lockers, definitely no inspirational posters about doing your best. Roman school happened right out in the open, in the middle of all the city's noise. You were basically trying to learn advanced philosophy in the middle of a chaotic farmer's market. Your school day starts when you show up at the ludus. This isn't a building. It's just a spot near a busy street or marketplace. Your teacher, the literator, is already there, sitting with the eternal expression of a man who wonders which god he offended to get stuck teaching teenagers for a living. Your classmates gather around, each with a wax tablet and a stylus, and the collective attention span of a bunch of caffeinated squirrels. The street is your backdrop. Kids run by screaming. A merchant is yelling about the superior quality of his olives. A stray dog wanders in and tries to eat your homework. Literally. And through all this, your teacher demands your absolute concentration. Your lessons, reading, writing, and basic math, sounds simple except you're doing it in two languages, Greek and Latin, because Romans decided their teenagers should suffer academically from two different directions at once. You practice carving letters into the wax, while your teacher walks around correcting your posture, your pronunciation, and apparently your entire life's trajectory. Then comes the big one, rhetoric. Forget algebra, forget science. Romans believed that if you could argue loudly and convincingly while waving your arms around, you could conquer the world. So you start practicing little speeches, simple debates, dramatic recitations of poetry. Your teacher insists every line must be delivered with enough passion to move the entire Senate to tears. Meanwhile, you're just trying not to get distracted by the fishmonger having a full-blown argument with a customer 3 feet away. If your family could afford the upgrade, you'd later move on to the grammaticus, the advanced teacher. Here, you dive into Greek literature, history, geometry, and the art of insulting someone using fancy, heroic vocabulary. You learn the difference between okay grammar, elegant grammar, and grammar so bad it would make Cicero's ghost rise from the dead to scold you. And the teachers were strict. Discipline was enforced with a stick that probably had a nickname. Somehow, that wasn't even the scariest part. The scariest part was the constant, crushing expectation. The expectation that you would grow up to be this perfectly spoken, perfectly mannered Roman citizen who never, ever embarrassed the family by, say, tripping over their own toga during a big speech. School in Rome was loud, demanding, chaotic, and absolutely relentless. But you learned, because in ancient Rome, education wasn't about getting a job. It was preparation for a life lived entirely in public. And in Rome, the public was always watching. By the time you hit your teens in Rome, the city has made one thing crystal clear. You are now useful. Not cute, not still finding yourself, not going through a phase. Useful. Rome believed in squeezing productivity out of every single person, from the moment you could walk without falling into a fountain. If you came from a poor or working family, your day was just one long list of chores. And we're not talking clean your room. We're talking real, back-breaking work. scrubbing floors, hauling water from a public fountain that's like 5 blocks away, chopping vegetables, feeding animals, weaving cloth until your fingers cramp, sweeping the courtyard in a cloud of your own dust. And laundry, oh the laundry. Roman laundry wasn't a chore. It was a form of warfare. Clothes were soaked in giant tubs, stomped on, scrubbed with rough brushes, rinsed and wrung out by hand. It was a process that somehow required every single relative to stand around and shout conflicting instructions at you. Just when you think you're done, your mom appears with another basket, looking at you like a disappointed goddess who expected more. If you were a boy from a modest family, you were probably apprenticed somewhere. Maybe to a blacksmith where your day was just sweat, soot, and being yelled at by a guy who communicated mostly in grunts and the sound of a hammer. Or maybe to a potter where your job was to carry heavy, wet clay and try very, very hard not to break anything expensive, because the potter had the patience of a tired bull. If you were a girl, your apprenticeship happened inside the home. You learned weaving, spinning, cooking, budgeting, how to store food so it wouldn't spoil, and the ancient Roman art of smiling politely while secretly solving everyone's problems. Your mother trained you like a general preparing a commander. One day, you'd run a household, and she would not let you embarrass the family by mismanaging the olive oil supply. Wealthy teens had chores too, don't get it twisted. There's just involved supervising the people doing the actual work. But trust me, Roman supervision was exhausting. You had to watch, you had to critique, you had to nod wisely at the right moments. You had to pretend to understand complex accounting while your dad lectured you about grain prices. And if you were super rich, you got the added burden of etiquette lessons. How to sit, how to stand, how to greet a senator, how to hand someone something without committing a social crime. No matter who you were, Rome expected you to contribute. Teenagers weren't decoration. They were workforce. By 13 or 14, you weren't preparing for adult life. You were already neck-deep in it, with all the responsibilities, chores, and adults yelling at you for reasons you don't fully understand. You'd think Roman teens had no time to breathe. But guess what? They still found a way to have a social life. A loud, dramatic, chaotic social life. Because Rome wasn't a city of quiet friendships. It was a city where friendships were forged in the beautiful chaos of the streets. Your crew was usually the kids you grew up with. Neighbors, classmates, cousins, the boy who once threw a jar into a fountain and blamed it on a stray dog, the girl who could argue a merchant down to half price better than most senators. Together, you formed a tiny army of teenage energy, and Rome was your massive, unregulated playground. And by playground, I mean a dangerous, crowded obstacle course. You'd dart between donkey carts, sidestep beggars and performers, dodge questionable puddles, and weave around merchants who considered shouting at teenagers a beloved hobby. You'd meet your friends in the forum, near the public fountains, or at whatever street vendor was selling hot bread or salty, garum-soaked snacks. Street food was your lifeline. You and your buddies would eat while debating the vital issues of the day. Which gladiator was the coolest? Whether your rhetoric teacher was secretly cursed by a witch. Who saw that senator trip over his own toga last week? The important stuff. Games were huge. You'd play ball games in cramped courtyards, board games with knucklebones, and about 100 chaotic versions of tag that had rules no adult could ever understand. Boys might wrestle or have mock sword fights. Nothing says friendship like trying to tackle your best friend into a pile of dirt. Girls socialized through weaving circles, gossip sessions, and the subtle art of rolling their eyes when adults weren't looking. But the ultimate hangout spot? The public baths. Even if you were broke, you'd save a coin or two for entry. Inside, it was a whole social universe. You'd sweat in the hot room, gasp in the cold plunge, whisper the latest gossip, brag about your tutors, complain about your parents, and pretend to be sophisticated adults while actually acting like the noisy teenagers you were. The steam made you feel like your secrets were safe. They weren't, but it felt that way. Of course, with so many rules, sneaking out was practically a required skill. Teens would slip away to watch charioteers practice, to listen to street poets, or to spy on gladiators training. Every little adventure was a mission, full of dramatic whispering and the occasional sprint when you thought you'd been caught. Friendships in Rome were fierce, loyal, loud, and unforgettable. Because when you grow up in a city that never stops moving, shouting, or judging, you hold tight to the few people who actually understand your brand of chaos. Being a teenager in Rome meant one thing above all else. Your outfit was actively trying to destroy you. Roman fashion wasn't about looking good. It was a daily battle between you, gravity, several yards of fabric, and the very real threat of public humiliation. And gravity usually won. Let's start with the boys. You wake up, put on your simple tunic, and then face the main event, wrapping yourself in the toga virilis. This thing was so dramatic, so heavy, so pointlessly large it could double as a small circus tent in an emergency. It had two goals: one, signal you were an adult, and two, trip you in front of someone important. No statue shows the truth. The toga slips, folds wrong. It develops a mind of its own. A light breeze hits, and you're suddenly doing an interpretive dance with a bedsheet while the whole street watches. Senators made it look easy because they had slaves adjusting it every 10 minutes. You're a teen trying not to get swallowed by a fabric tornado. Girls had their own fashion nightmares. You wore the stola and the palla, long, flowing garments that were lovely in paintings. In reality, they were heavy and determined to catch on every piece of furniture, door frame, or confused goat you walked past. You'd tie your hair up in elaborate styles that needed 3 pins, 2 prayers, and the patience of Jupiter himself. And then one gust of wind would ruin it all, and you'd accidentally invent a new hairstyle. Accessories weren't optional. Your jewelry told the whole city your family's financial situation. Earrings, bracelets, brooches, Romans loved shiny things. If you were rich, you wore gold and glass beads. If you were poor, you wore bone, clay, or whatever your uncle traded for at the market. Hopefully, it wasn't cursed. Footwear? Sandals. Great in summer, tolerable in spring, absolutely miserable in winter. And the straps always broke at the worst possible moment. Always. Usually when you were trying to look dignified or when you had to cross a puddle that definitely did not come from rain. And remember, Rome was judgmental. The whole city was one giant fashion runway, and every citizen was a harsh critic. Too plain? Suspicious. Too fancy? Also suspicious. Wrinkled tunic? Unforgivable. Let your toga touch the ground? You have shamed your ancestors for generations. Roman fashion demanded 2 things: total confidence and the ability to adjust your clothes every 30 seconds without anyone noticing. You were draped in symbolism, wrapped in social pressure, and held together by hope and a few well-placed pins. Welcome to ancient Rome, where even your outfit had political opinions and a personal vendetta against you. You finally wrestled yourself into your clothes. Now it's time to face the final boss. Actually going outside. Stepping out of your house as a Roman teenager was like entering a live-action obstacle course designed by the gods for their personal amusement. The streets of Rome weren't streets in the modern sense. They were living, breathing organisms. Loud, unpredictable, dramatic, and absolutely determined to trip you, splash you, or convert you to a new religion before you even made it to lunch. The moment your sandal hit the cobblestone, the city grabbed you by your tunic and shook you awake. Vendors were already in a shouting competition, each trying to rupture your eardrums first. Fresh bread, fresh fish, fresh lies. You learned fast that everything in Rome was advertised loudly, confidently, and with aggressive, unblinking eye contact. Then the smells hit. Rome had a scent profile that modern science still can't fully explain. It was a powerful blend of baking bread, frying olive oil, temple incense, human sweat, animal dung, wine, sewage with smoke, roasting meat, and whatever your neighbor had just dumped out of his window. Every corner smelled different. Every corner smelled honest. Navigating was an extreme sport. First, you dodged carts pulled by donkeys who had zero respect for pedestrian rights. Then you sidestepped beggars, street performers, stray dogs, and little kids running around like they just discovered sugar. The cobblestones were uneven, the alleys were narrow, and half the population was yelling at the other half. You'd pass shops crammed into every nook, bakers pulling steaming loaves from brick ovens, blacksmiths hammering metal so loud your teeth rattled, barbers giving shaves right out in the open, tavern owners calling out offers that promised you a good time and a guaranteed headache tomorrow. Street performers were everywhere. Musicians strumming lyres. Poets reciting verses with the confidence of people who've never been booed. Acrobats attempting flips that made your mom mutter a quick prayer for their safety. And the traffic. If you heard the rumble of chariot wheels, you moved. Fast. Roman drivers lived by two rules. 1. Speed is life, and 2. Pedestrians should have been paying attention. Teens would often sprint out of the way dramatically, then pretend afterward they totally weren't scared. You'd also pass soldiers on patrol, walking reminders that Rome was powerful, organized, and always watching. They didn't smile. They didn't wave. They just stared at you like you were one clumsy toga step away from becoming their paperwork for the day. Yet, for all the chaos, the smells, the shouting, and the near-death experiences, the streets of Rome were thrilling. They were alive. They were dangerous. They were unforgettable. And as a teenager, they were your whole world. You think that's it? Just school, chores, and trying not to die in traffic? Please, if there's one thing Roman teenagers loved more than complaining, it was a festival. And ancient Rome had a lot of festivals. So many, you'd sometimes wonder if the entire empire was just one long party, interrupted occasionally by wars and tax collection. Festivals in Rome were everything your normal life wasn't. Loud, chaotic, joyful, reckless, and suspiciously low on rules, which, of course, meant teenagers were all over it. Let's start with the big one, Saturnalia. For one glorious week in December, Rome flipped upside down. Social rules? Gone. Masters served their slaves. Families exchanged gifts. Gambling in the street was suddenly totally fine. And teenagers were basically allowed to act like a herd of overexcited goats with zero adult supervision. You wore bright clothes, you shouted nonsense in the streets, and you ate enough honey cakes to put yourself in a sugar coma. It was glorious. Then there was Lupercalia, a festival that modern parents would absolutely ban if they knew about it. Teenagers would gather to watch priests, half naked by the way, run through the city, smacking people with strips of goat hide for fertility. You pretended you were only there ironically, but deep down, everyone your age found it hilarious, chaotic, and a little bit concerning. Floralia was another springtime favorite, a festival of flowers, dancing, wild theatrical performances, and people acting incredibly dramatic despite being completely sober. Teenage girls loved it for the flower crowns and the chance to wear their best stola. Teenage boys loved it for reasons they'd never admit when their parents asked. Every festival came with food stalls, performers, music, and that special Roman carnival chaos. You'd wander with your friends, eating roasted nuts or little honey fritters, while street magicians did tricks that definitely involved cheating, but were entertaining anyway. You'd watch actors perform raunchy comedies in masks so exaggerated they could haunt your dreams. Acrobats flipped, musicians played, people danced like nobody was watching because in that crowd nobody was. But festivals weren't the only show in town. The Colosseum and the amphitheaters were like magnets for bored teens. You and your friends would sneak off to watch gladiators train. These muscular warriors practiced with wooden swords, and you'd pretend you were there for educational purposes. Sure you were. The energy, the cheering, the sheer drama of it all was totally addictive. Your mom said the games were too violent. Your dad said they were culturally important. You just thought they were awesome. Then there was the Circus Maximus, home of chariot racing, the ancient version of Formula One mixed with a street fight. Teens picked their favorite teams, painted faction symbols on their sandals, and screamed themselves hoarse as horses and chariots tore around the track at what seemed like supersonic speed. Winning felt like a personal triumph. Losing felt like a personal betrayal. Festivals and games weren't just entertainment. They were freedom. They were pure, unregulated joy. They were the explosive heartbeat of Roman teenage life, pounding loud enough to drown out, just for a little while, all those other expectations. If you think Roman bathhouses were quiet, relaxing spa days where people whispered and enjoyed some peace, congratulations. You've clearly never been to Rome. The public baths were the beating, sweaty, noisy heart of Roman social life. Loud, crowded, humid, chaotic, and still somehow everyone's favorite place to hang out. As a Roman teenager, the baths were the spot. You and your friends didn't say, "Let's meet up." You said, "Meet me at the baths." 'Cause honestly, where else were you gonna go? The streets were a hazard. The forum was full of arguing adults. And your house was just a pile of chores waiting to attack you. The baths were neutral territory. A sanctuary of steam, gossip, and questionable water. Entry was cheap even for poorer families. You'd hand over a small coin, walk inside, and immediately get slapped in the face by a wall of heat and humidity. It hit you harder than your rhetoric teacher's stick when you messed up a verb conjugation. Inside was a maze of rooms. The apodyterium, changing room, the tepidarium, warm room, the caldarium, hot room, and the frigidarium, the infamous cold plunge. Each one offered a unique experience, and none of them involved anything close to peace and quiet. You'd strip down in the changing room, stash your stuff in a little cubby, and pray the attendant was honest that day. Theft happened. A lot. Everyone just pretended it was part of the bathhouse charm. Then you'd move into the warm room to let your body adjust, along with about 50 other people who'd had the exact same idea. The hot room was where the magic happened. The steam was so thick you could barely see your own hand. Middle-aged men loudly debated politics. Old men complained about their knees, the youth, and the state of the empire. And teenagers, they whispered gossip so juicy it could topple a senator. The heat wasn't just warm. It was, "I can feel my soul sweating" warm. Your hair would frizz instantly. Your skin would get moisturized whether it wanted to or not. Then came the dare, the cold plunge, the Roman test of courage. You jump in, your body would scream, and you try not to gasp like a dying fish while your friends pointed and laughed. The water was colder than the look your mom gave you when you came home with a torn tunic. Between dips, you'd snack on cheap food, chat, complain about teachers, admire the graffiti of gladiators scratched into the walls, and pretend you weren't staring at your crush from across the room. The bathhouse was the one place where you could actually relax, socialize, and pretend the heavy weight of adulthood wasn't sprinting toward you at gladiator speed. The baths weren't just about getting clean. They were therapy. They were community. They were the ancient Roman version of the mall, the gym, the coffee shop, and the group chat, all mashed into one glorious, steamy, slightly suspicious building. You think modern parents have high expectations? Ancient Roman parents would like to have a word. In Rome, family expectations hit you with the force of a runaway chariot, and there was no escape. You were a teenager, yes, but Rome did not care. Rome believed you were ready, mature, and responsible, despite all evidence to the contrary. Your family didn't just hope you'd succeed. They expected it. Because Rome was a society built entirely on reputation. Your family's honor mattered more than your comfort, your feelings, or the fact that your toga was currently trying to trip you down the front stairs. If you were a boy, your father sat you down for the talk, not the modern version, the Roman version. It went something like this: "Son, you must bring honor to this family. Train your mind, train your body, learn the law, master rhetoric, observe the forum, and for Jupiter's sake, stop slouching. The neighbors are watching." Then he gestured dramatically toward the horizon, as if the gods themselves were taking notes. Your mother listened nearby, nodding like she was signing off on your future resume. She'd remind you that your every action reflected on the entire household. How you walked, spoke, ate, greeted people, even how you breathed in public, had to be done with the calculated precision of a miniature senator. If you were a girl, the pressure was even more intense. Your mother took over your training like a general preparing a commander for war. You had to learn to run a household with military efficiency. Budgeting, supervising servants, weaving, cleaning, organizing storage, managing guests, overseeing religious rituals, and ensuring the family had enough olive oil to survive the next decade. No big deal. And then there was marriage. Marriage wasn't some distant, romantic idea. It was a strategic alliance already in the planning stages, often before you'd even figured out if you liked poetry. Your parents strategized about dowries, political connections, and which potential husband had the fewest rumors attached to him. You sat quietly, nodding politely, while internally screaming into the void. Roman families expected discipline. They expected modesty. They expected achievement. They expected obedience. They expected you to act with the calm composure of a 45-year-old politician while you were still a kid trying to shake the street dust out of your sandals. There was no such thing as teenage rebellion in Rome. Not because teens didn't feel rebellious, they absolutely did, but because rebellion usually ended with a 3-hour lecture on honor, duty, your ancestors, Jupiter, and how your bad attitude might cause the next drought. Rome didn't just raise teenagers, it forged them, under pressure, under expectations, under the watching, judging eyes of the entire neighborhood. For all its politics, noise, and questionable street smells, ancient Rome still had one universal constant: teenagers developing absolutely dramatic, earth-shattering crushes. The kind of crushes that could power an entire amphitheater's worth of dramatic poetry. Love in Rome was chaotic, inconvenient, thrilling, risky, and totally unavoidable. Just like everything else in this city. Let's start with the basics. Roman teenagers fell hard and they fell fast. You'd glance across the forum, see someone adjust their toga without falling over, and suddenly you were convinced the gods had sent you a divine sign. You'd spot someone at the baths, their hair miraculously surviving the steam, and your heart would decide, yep, this is destiny. Never mind that you'd never actually spoken to them. Details. Your friends were no help, of course. They encouraged everything. You should talk to them. You should write a poem. You should pretend you need directions to the Temple of Vesta. Even though you've lived here your whole life, teenage Romans were inventing bad romantic advice long before the internet existed. If you were a boy, you'd try to impress your crush with smooth moves like standing near them awkwardly, gesturing way too much in conversations they weren't part of, or pretending your toga wasn't trying to strangle you. You might try to write a poetic line, inspired by Ovid. It would usually end up sounding more like a grocery list with feelings. If you were a girl, things were way more complicated. You couldn't just walk up and say, "Hi." That was scandalous. Instead, you mastered the art of the sideways glance. Subtle, strategic, devastating. You'd pass each other in the market, carefully pretending not to notice while noticing every single detail. You'd exchange a tiny, shy smile while your mothers haggled over the price of lentils. Love letters existed, but they weren't folded notes. They were wax tablets with dramatic lines like, "Your beauty outshines Venus herself," which your parents absolutely could not find lying around. If they did, you'd get a lecture so long it could span 2 consuls' terms. Of course, there was always the risk of gossip. Rome was the world capital of gossip. You'd confide in one friend, and by sunset, the whole neighborhood had opinions on your imaginary romance. Senators gossiped, bakers gossiped, the stray dogs probably gossiped, and yet, love persisted, despite the rules, the parents, the toga malfunctions. Because even in a city obsessed with duty and honor, Roman teenagers found ways to feel everything intensely, to hope, to dream, to flirt badly, to imagine futures way bigger than the walls of their family home. In Rome, love wasn't a private thing. It was public art. It was drama. It was survival. And occasionally, it was a complete and total disaster. By the time you're pushing 18 in ancient Rome, the city has already decided your fate. Not asked, decided. Rome didn't wait for you to discover yourself or find your passion. Rome believed all that navel-gazing belonged in Greek philosophy books, not in your actual life. You were expected to step into adulthood with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, despite the fact that you absolutely positively did not. If you were a boy, adulthood arrived with a thud. Suddenly, your father was dragging you to the forum, introducing you to people you'd never met but were supposed to impress. Senators, merchants, magistrates, all of them giving you advice you didn't ask for. One would pat your shoulder and say, "You must uphold Roman values," and you'd nod politely, even though you still panicked every time your toga needed adjusting. Your future was a buffet of heavy responsibility. Law, politics, military service, taking over the family business. And just when you thought you were choosing a path, the adults reminded you of the other duties. Honoring ancestors, maintaining the family's good name, avoiding scandal, making smart financial moves, and, of course, one day producing heirs. No pressure. If you were a girl, adulthood wasn't a step. It was a vault. You were expected to run a household with the precision of a military commander. You managed servants, budgeted resources, organized religious duties, planned meals, hosted guests, oversaw weaving, and smiled gracefully through every single crisis your family managed to create. And then there was marriage. Marriage wasn't a romantic journey. It was a strategic alliance, a long-term management plan, and the ancient Roman version of please, for the love of Jupiter, don't embarrass us. You learned to navigate your new household with a mix of charm, patience, sharp intelligence, and the quiet, burning rage of someone who hadn't had a day off since they were 12. Everyone watched you, everyone judged you, everyone expected greatness, or, at the very least, flawless competence, which in Rome was pretty much the same thing. But here's the wild part. As overwhelming as it all was, Roman teenagers adapted. They rose to the challenge. Yeah, they complained quietly. Yeah, they panicked internally. Yeah, they sometimes wished Jupiter would just give them a break. But Rome shaped them. Its noise made them tough. Its expectations sharpened their minds. Its chaos prepared them for a life lived proudly in the world's craziest, greatest city. You were no longer just a teenager. You were a Roman, an adult in the empire. Ready or not, Rome was marching forward. And now you were marching with it. That's a wrap on the Roman teenage experience, the chaos, the pressure, the joy. If you've enjoyed this journey from dawn to adulthood, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support lets me keep diving deep into history's wildest stories. Let me know in the comments what your favorite part was. We're shifting gears now, leaving the crowded streets of Rome for the candlelit halls of medieval Europe. We're about to dive into one of the weirdest social inventions of all time, courtly love. And if you're into tales of drama, secret codes, and absolute romantic chaos, you're in the right place. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. It's the medieval equivalent of swearing fealty to your favorite troubadour, and it helps the channel more than you know. Now, let's get into it. In the 12th century, Europe stumbled into something strange. A cultural loophole where falling desperately, passionately, and mathematically impossible in love wasn't a moral failure. It was a flex. Forget, thou shalt not commit adultery. The aristocracy invented a new rule. Adore someone intensely, but never, ever touch them. This was romance turned into a philosophical sport, complete with rules, rituals, and an alarming number of poems written by guys who probably hadn't seen a bathhouse in months. At the heart of courtly love was one simple idea: impossibility. The perfect woman was almost always married, usually to someone powerful, usually much older, and usually the kind of guy who thought poetry was suspiciously French and therefore a threat to national security. But that obstacle wasn't a bug in the system. It was the whole point. A love you could actually have was boring. Common. A love you could never have? That was noble. That was perfection. Medieval poets insisted the purest love was the kind that stayed unfulfilled. The kind that tortured you politely while you wrote verses about a woman who might not even know your name. This romance required a performance. The knight wasn't supposed to actually seduce the lady. Oh no, that would be crude. Instead, he was meant to worship her like she was an earthly angel, the moral compass of his soul. He might carry her token into battle. A ribbon, a glove, maybe a piece of lace she definitely didn't know he'd snipped off her dress. He'd declare his loyalty to her in song, in tournaments, even in front of her husband, who was, awkwardly, often the guy sponsoring the tournament. The lady had her own role. She was supposed to inspire virtue, correct the knight's behavior with polite coldness, and reject him with just enough grace to make him love her even more. Her job was to be unattainable while pretending she appreciated the effort. In a world where noble women had very little real power, this bizarre romantic system accidentally gave them a new kind of influence. The power to make men compete, suffer, write terrible poetry, and generally behave better, all without leaving their castle. So from the start, courtly love wasn't about kissing or touching or sneaking around. It was about longing. weaponized longing, a socially approved heartbreak, a nobleman's fancy excuse to stare at someone else's wife and call it philosophy. To really get courtly love, you gotta understand the role of the medieval noblewoman, or more accurately, the myth of her. In theory, she was the moral North Star of the entire aristocratic universe. Pure, elegant, wiser than Aristotle, blessed with the kind of emotional intelligence that could turn a violent, grunting knight into a gentleman with just one look. In reality, she was usually a practical, politically savvy woman managing estates, marriage alliances, household budgets, pregnancies, and the occasional plague outbreak. But medieval poets weren't writing about real women. They were writing about the lady, a fictional creature who lived almost entirely in their imagination, and sometimes in their saddlebags as an embroidered handkerchief. The pedestal they put her on was sky-high. Poets described their chosen lady as someone whose beauty could soften the wrath of God, whose smile could tame lions, whose voice could heal battle wounds. Real noblewomen, meanwhile, were busy making sure the grain harvest didn't get stolen by bandits. But in this romantic fantasy, the woman wasn't a person. She was a symbol, a muse, a judge, a source of spiritual enlightenment. She wasn't meant to be human so much as she was meant to be perfect. The lady also became an extremely convenient excuse for, well, everything. Knights claimed they fought harder in battle not for glory or loot, but for her. Their bravery, their courtesy, even their sudden interest in personal hygiene. All of it was supposedly in service to a woman they weren't allowed to touch. If a knight behaved badly, poets said it was because he lacked a guiding lady. If he behaved well, it was because a lady had inspired him. Medieval women were apparently responsible for everything except the weather. But life on a pedestal had its downsides. A noblewoman being worshipped by a knight who wasn't her husband had to walk a tightrope. If she encouraged him too much, she risked being accused of adultery. If she rejected him too harshly, she broke the rules of courtesy. She had to gently decline his advances while letting him continue the emotional melodrama that fueled his poetry. Think of it as the medieval version of having a super persistent admirer you can't block, all while trying to maintain your reputation. Except this admirer shows up in chainmail, reciting metaphors about your eyelashes. Yet, for all the absurdity, this idealization gave noble women an unexpected kind of social gravity. In a society that rarely let women have direct power, being placed on a pedestal, even an imaginary kind of annoying one, could tilt the world ever so slightly in their favor. If the noblewoman was placed on a pedestal, the medieval knight placed himself somewhere far less dignified, usually on his knees, swearing eternal loyalty to someone who could end the whole thing with one raised eyebrow. In courtly love, a knight's devotion wasn't some casual crush. It was a full-time emotional occupation, complete with rituals, vows, and a level of dramatic suffering that modern audiences would call unpaid community theater. The knight began by picking a lady, the ideal choice, someone married, socially superior, and as unavailable as humanly possible. This wasn't a mistake. It was the main feature. If love was easy, it wasn't noble. A married woman guaranteed the knight's desire remained distant, painful, and, most importantly, excellent material for poetry. He wasn't supposed to win her. He was supposed to long for her in dignified, courteous agony. Then he'd pledge total obedience to her, which was extremely convenient for poets and extremely awkward for husbands. His vows sounded like a weird mix of religious devotion and a personal soap opera. He promised to defend her honor, follow her every command, improve himself morally, and, if necessary, die gloriously in her name. Ideally, he'd avoid the actual dying part, but the threat of it made for better poetry. This devotion showed up everywhere. A knight might carry her colors, a ribbon, a scarf, a piece of fabric she never actually gave him, but which he claimed was a sacred relic. He might perform like a superstar in a tournament, then publicly announce that his victory belonged entirely to her. If he lost, he'd blame himself for not being worthy. A surprising number of medieval emotional crises involved knights apologizing to their ladies after getting knocked off a horse. Longing became a lifestyle, A knight in the courtly love tradition was supposed to be constantly on the edge of an emotional cliff, sighing dramatically, composing verses, gazing pensively at the horizon, as if waiting for a divine sign to just go say hello. Was it love? Was it self-inflicted emotional chaos? Was it a medieval version of fan culture, where the lady didn't know she had a fan club? Maybe a little of all three, but the suffering was essential. The pain proved his depth. The restraint proved his virtue. And the distance, the impossible, forbidden, irresistible distance between knight and lady, was the engine that kept this whole bizarre system running. Courtly love didn't just happen. It came with a rulebook, an entire unwritten constitution that decided how a knight could adore a woman without accidentally starting a scandal big enough to kick off a family feud. Medieval poets and intellectuals took these rules as seriously as state treaties. If modern dating had half the structure, you'd need a lawyer just to send a flirty text. The most famous rulebook came from a guy named Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century cleric whose job apparently included writing down the romantic delusions of the aristocracy. His treatise, De Amore, about love, laid out dozens of principles. These weren't gentle suggestions. They were rigid, drama-fueling commandments. For example, love cannot exist between husband and wife. Yep, the medieval world officially decided marriage was too boring to count as real love. If you loved your spouse, you were doing it wrong. The rules also emphasized secrecy, which was ironic because half the troubadours in Europe made careers out of gossiping through song about who loved who. But secrecy preserved dignity, or at least the illusion of dignity. A knight's devotion had to be private enough to avoid scandal, yet public enough to boost his reputation. A tough tightrope to walk in 70 pounds of armor. Another big rule: love thrives on difficulty. If things were going smoothly, something was clearly wrong. Obstacles were vital. Distance, disapproval, angry husbands with crossbows. These weren't problems. They were ingredients. Without suffering, a knight wasn't truly in love. He was just having a pleasant afternoon, and pleasant afternoons were not poetic. The lady, meanwhile, had her own rulebook. She had to show mercy without encouragement, and firmness without cruelty. Too cold, and she violated courtesy. Too warm, and she violated everything else. Her responses had to be measured in millimeters. Just enough kindness to keep the knight devoted. Just enough restraint to stop the rumors. Courtly love also demanded moral improvement. A knight had to use his longing to become a better man. More virtuous, more courageous, more refined. If he didn't come out of this emotional circus improved, he'd failed the assignment. So yes, this was romance, but it was regulated romance. A passion so carefully choreographed that even forbidden desire had an approved aesthetic. For better or worse, this rulebook shaped how Europe thought about love for centuries. If courtly love was a cultural fire, then troubadours were the guys running around with torches, happily setting more stuff ablaze. These poet-musicians from southern France took the raw emotional chaos of noble longing and turned it into the medieval equivalent of chart-topping hits. Imagine a world where every popular song on the radio is about someone's hopeless crush on a married noblewoman. That was 12th century Provence. A troubadour's job was part poet, part performer, part gossip columnist. They composed elaborate verses about knights who adored ladies they could never touch, and ladies who inspired knights by refusing to touch them. Their lyrics turned yearning into an art form. A single sigh from a lady could fuel an entire ballad. A glance from her could fill a whole album. And if she actually said a sentence to the knight, congratulations, that was basically an emotional Grammy. Troubadours were the ultimate hype men for courtly love. Their songs traveled from castle to castle, carried by the troubadours themselves, by knights who memorized them, and by princesses who brought the tradition north when they married foreign kings. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then Queen of England. She was basically the Beyoncé of courtly love promotion. Thanks to her, the entire European aristocracy got hooked on the idea that the highest form of love was structured emotional torment. But troubadours didn't just entertain. They shaped reputations. A knight could commission a poet to sing about his devotion, a medieval PR strategy. A lady could gain serious social prestige through songs praising her beauty and virtue. On the flip side, a poorly written poem could start serious trouble. The troubadour who hinted a little too strongly about a noblewoman's secret admirer could spark rumors, feuds, or in extreme cases, actual warfare. Nothing says romantic tension like accidentally starting a regional conflict. The poetry itself exaggerated reality to mythical proportions. The knight became a flawless hero. The lady became a goddess. The husband became an obstacle with a very unfortunate personality. Troubadours used metaphors like they were going out of style. A lady's hands were whiter than milk. Her eyes were bright as swords. Her heart was fortified like a castle. Real women were probably just trying to supervise the linen inventory in peace. Yet the power of these performers was undeniable. They turned longing into entertainment, secrecy into spectacle, personal heartbreak into a collective cultural obsession. Without troubadours, courtly love would have stayed a niche hobby for bored aristocrats. With them, it became Europe's most fashionable madness. To get why courtly love blew up, you need to understand medieval marriage. Or, more accurately, the stunning lack of romance inside it. Marriage among nobles wasn't about feelings. It was a business deal, about property, alliances, land rights, heirs, and making sure your neighbor didn't invade you next spring. Emotions were, at best, irrelevant. At worst, they were a liability. From the moment a noble kid was born, their marriage was basically pre-decided. Families negotiated matches like chess moves. A daughter might be engaged at 3, married at 12, and running a household before she was a teenager. Her personal feelings? Not part of the deal. Her future husband's personality? Also not part of the deal. If he was twice her age and built like a grumpy bear, that was just her new life. For men, it wasn't much more romantic. A knight might dream of adventure and a woman who actually smiled at him. Instead, he was told to marry whoever brought the best land deal. Marital affection could happen, sure, but no one counted on it. That was just luck, like finding an unrat-infested grain store. So into this emotional desert walked courtly love. A system where nobles were allowed, even encouraged, to feel big, dramatic feelings, as long as it wasn't for their actual spouse. Adultery itself was still a major no-no. But emotional adultery? That was practically a noble pastime. A woman stuck in a political marriage could enjoy the admiration of a dashing knight. A knight trapped in a marriage of convenience could pour all his yearning into an idealized, untouchable lady. Courtly love was, in a strange way, the pressure valve of the aristocracy. It made emotional life interesting again. It created drama, excitement, a sense of purpose. The contradiction was wild. Medieval society publicly condemned adultery while privately glamorizing a romantic system built entirely around wanting someone you couldn't have. But the truth is simple. Courtly love existed because medieval marriage almost never involved love. When your spouse is assigned like a feudal tax, your heart looks for somewhere else to go, preferably toward someone who inspires better poetry. For a system built on desiring someone you weren't supposed to touch, courtly love tiptoed very close to the line of actual adultery. So close that armies of clergy, nobles, and irritated husbands spent centuries arguing about where, exactly, that line was. The official rule was simple: courtly love must stay pure, untouched, wonderfully impossible. The unofficial reality? Let's just say plenty of medieval couples treated the rules more like creative suggestions. The whole system rested on a fascinating skill: pretending. A knight could swear lifelong devotion to another man's wife, as long as he did it in polished poetry and not in a dark corridor. A lady could accept his admiration as long as her tone said, "I cherish your noble devotion," and not, "Meet me behind the dovecot." In theory, it was emotional theater without physical consequences. But humans are humans, even in chainmail. And a knight writing his 14th poem about a woman's hair wasn't always satisfied with just metaphors. Troubadours didn't help. Their songs blurred lines, hinted at secret rendezvous, and occasionally slipped into "we all know what's really happening" territory. Courts buzzed with whispers. Which lady's knight had gotten too bold? Which husband was pretending not to notice? Which poet needed to be exiled for insinuating a little too much? The fact that so many romantic stories ended with "we will never consummate this love" should tell you everything about how often the opposite probably happened. The church, predictably, hated all of it. Clerics warned that loving someone only in the heart was still a spiritual threat, like adultery performed entirely with sighs. They preached sermons condemning lust disguised as nobility and accused troubadours of spreading moral decay through catchy tunes. Meanwhile, nobles attended these sermons while wearing their lady's ribbon on their sleeve. Husbands had the hardest time. Publicly, they had to act dignified. Courtly love was trendy, after all. Privately, many were furious. Medieval records are full of suspicious references to jealous husbands, sudden duels, and cases where a knight, accidentally, fell out of a high tower window. Yet, being admired by a famous knight also boosted a lady's, and therefore her household's, prestige. So most husbands swallowed their pride and hoped their wife's admirer stayed in the poetic suffering stage and never escalated to the actual scandal stage. Courtly love balanced on a knife's edge. A love that had to look adulterous without becoming adulterous. It had to inspire desire without fulfilling it. It had to burn brightly without catching the castle on fire. And somehow, against all logic, it worked. Most of the time. For something supposedly pure and uplifting, courtly love had a spectacular talent for causing absolute chaos. Knights fell for the wrong women. Kings grew suspicious. Troubadours spread rumors that spiraled out of control. And sometimes the whole delicate system escalated into political crisis, open warfare, or a full-blown papal meltdown. This wasn't just poetry. This was geopolitics with better metaphors. Take the famous case of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her court in Poitiers became the medieval equivalent of a romantic think tank. Filled with troubadours inventing new rules of love, ladies debating romantic ethics, and knights practicing chivalry with an enthusiasm that made a lot of husbands very nervous. Some historians argue these games of flirtation and song contributed directly to the tensions that wrecked her marriage to King Louis VII of France. When a queen uses emotional devotion as political leverage, all of Europe pays attention. Or consider Marie de Champagne. She turned courtly love into a moral courtroom. She presided over love trials, where nobles would debate theoretical romantic dilemmas. Can true love exist in marriage? Can a lady love two men at once? These were intellectual exercises, sure, but they shaped real attitudes about loyalty, adultery, and power. Ideas have consequences, especially when whispered into royal ears. Then there were the actual battles sparked by affairs disguised under the elegant banner of courtly devotion. More than one knight died defending a lady's honor, or at least defending the rumor that he was defending her honor. A nobleman publicly claiming devotion to the wrong woman could trigger family feuds, castle sieges, and long-standing alliances collapsing because someone wrote one poem too many. The church, already suspicious of this emotional free-for-all, doubled down on condemnation when scandals hit the political big time. Some clerics compared courtly love to heresy, a system where humans worshipped other humans with a devotion that belonged only to God. The idea that a knight could kneel before his lady the way he knelt before an altar was spiritually dangerous and politically destabilizing. One bishop even warned that courtly love corrupts kingdoms faster than war. Strong words from a man who probably never had a troubadour write him a ballad. But despite the conflicts, the excommunications, and the occasional funeral with way too much poetry, courtly love endured. It fed egos, shaped diplomacy, and gave bored nobles something to obsess over between crusades. In a world built on hierarchy and duty, forbidden affection was the one unpredictable spark that could set everything in motion. Sometimes beautifully, sometimes catastrophically. By the time the Middle Ages limped toward their end, exhausted by plagues, wars, and some truly questionable fashion, courtly love had already carved its name deep into European culture. What started as a poetic hobby for bored French aristocrats grew into a continent-wide phenomenon that reshaped romance, literature, and the way people understood desire itself. Even though the system was contradictory, impractical, and occasionally lethal, its legacy still echoes today. Let's break it down. First, courtly love invented romantic idealization as we know it. The idea that love is ennobling, transformative, spiritually uplifting, that came from here. Before this, European literature was mostly about battles, saints, and biblical disasters. Courtly love introduced something new: interior emotion. Suddenly, poetry wasn't just about slaying dragons. It was about the agony of longing, the thrill of a glance, the psychological tornado that happens when someone beautiful walks past and ruins your whole week. It also transformed literature forever. From troubadour songs to the Arthurian romances, the emotional tension between forbidden lovers became Europe's favorite story engine. Think Lancelot and Guinevere, the ultimate courtly love disaster duo. Their romance wasn't just a subplot. It was the moral earthquake that shook King Arthur's entire world. Authors everywhere devoured the formula. Noble hero, unattainable lady, dangerous longing, tragic consequences. It was the medieval blockbuster template. Even modern romance novels and movies owe the Middle Ages a debt. The tropes are all there. Unrequited love, the beloved on a pedestal, love as a form of suffering, love as destiny. Every time a character in a book sighs dramatically or a movie treats a crush like a cosmic event, you're hearing a faint echo of a 12th century poet in Provence, rhyming heart with martyr. But courtly love was never just an art movement. It revealed something real about medieval society, a deep hunger for emotion in a world crushed by duty. Nobles lived in a rigid hierarchy, bound by political marriages and relentless responsibility. Courtly love was their escape hatch, a socially approved rebellion that let them feel intensely while pretending they weren't breaking any rules. In the end, this bizarre, beautiful, deeply impractical system became Europe's favorite madness because it made life more dramatic, more poetic, more human. And even now, centuries later, the idea that love must be longed for, not just possessed, still lingers in our stories. A quiet, medieval whisper, still guiding the modern heart. That's the wrap on courtly love, the rules, the drama, the legacy. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Truly helps. We're switching eras completely next, to a time when medicine decided women's emotions were a disease. Alright, buckle up. We're time traveling again, leaving the castles of medieval Europe for the stuffy parlors of the Victorian era. And we're diving into one of history's most disturbing chapters, the moment medicine decided that being a woman was basically a medical condition. If you're new to the journey, hit subscribe. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss any of these deep dives into history's weirdest corners. Now, let's get into it. Victorian medicine had a special talent. It could turn almost anything a woman did into a symptom. Not eating enough? Illness. Eating too much? Also illness. Feeling tired? Illness. Feeling energetic? Definitely an illness. And if a woman dared to express an opinion, or heaven forbid boredom, anger, or desire, doctors reached for their notebooks like they discovered a new species of exotic animal. The era produced real scientific breakthroughs, sure, but it also created an astonishing catalog of totally fabricated female disorders that would be laughable if they weren't used to control millions of lives. The most infamous of these was hysteria. According to Victorian doctors, nearly anything could trigger it. Too much reading, too little reading, riding a horse, reading novels, not wanting children, wanting too many children, or just existing in a room without what they called fresh air for slightly too long. Hysteria became the medical Swiss Army knife. It explained everything, which meant it explained nothing. And crucially, it was almost always diagnosed in women. Men apparently were immune. How convenient. But hysteria wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a framework. One that medicalized a woman's entire personality, her emotions, her frustrations, her desires. If a woman was sad because she had no legal rights, she was hysterical. If she was angry because her husband treated her like fancy furniture, she was hysterical. If she expressed sexual desire, that wasn't normal human behavior. That was pathology. And so doctors reached for their tools. Sedation, isolation, electrotherapy, ice-cold baths, rest cures, and enough laudanum, a mix of opium and alcohol, to tranquilize a horse. Victorians loved the illusion of scientific legitimacy. So instead of asking if a woman's distress had social causes, like being trapped in a loveless marriage or being forbidden an education, they turned her suffering into a tidy medical label. The fancier the label sounded, the easier it was to ignore the real problem. Hysteria made men feel logical, it made women feel silenced, and it made society feel justified. Even worse, these diagnoses often hid the darkest truth. Desire itself was treated as a malfunction. If a woman wanted intimacy or pleasure, doctors saw it like a fever that needed cooling, a flame that needed to be snuffed out. In a world obsessed with moral purity and female obedience, diagnosing women became the perfect tool for policing them. Victorian medicine didn't just treat imaginary illnesses, created them, and thousands of women paid the price for symptoms they never truly had. To really get Victorian medicine, you gotta understand it wasn't just about the body. It was about morality wearing a stethoscope. Doctors weren't just diagnosing sickness. They were enforcing an entire worldview. They believed society was held together by delicate threads of purity, obedience, and rigid gender roles. And if one woman tugged at those threads, civilization itself might unravel like a cheap corset. So medicine became a weapon. Not intentionally cruel, maybe, but catastrophically confident. Victorian doctors saw themselves as guardians of the social order. They saw women as naturally fragile, emotional, and constitutionally unsuited for stress, which was very convenient because it meant women could be blamed for almost anything while also being excluded from anything important. If a woman wanted an education, independence, or control over her own body, doctors insisted these desires were morally dangerous, and therefore medically dangerous. So they invented diagnoses to match. The concept of degeneracy became super fashionable. This wasn't a real medical condition. It was a fear that society was declining, that modern life was corrupting morals, and that women's desires were the first sign of the collapse. A woman who read too much, she risked moral overexcitement. A woman who enjoyed physical exercise, she risked becoming masculinized. A woman who spoke too freely, she risked mental derangement. Everything was a slippery slope into decay. Doctors tied morality to biology with wild confidence. They claimed a woman's entire personality was governed by her reproductive system. If she was sad, her uterus was acting up. If she was anxious, her uterus was misaligned. If she was angry, her uterus was wandering around her body looking for trouble. This was a theory that was outdated even by ancient Greek standards, yet somehow it got a second life in Victorian England. The era also had extreme anxiety about female sexuality. Desire wasn't seen as natural. It was seen as dangerous, a force that could corrupt society, ruin marriages, and weaken men. Doctors wrote solemn warnings that too much pleasure could cause insanity, infertility, or moral decay. They recommended sedation, cold baths, and strict supervision to protect both the woman and the world from her own impulses. In reality, these diagnoses reflected Victorian fears far more than they reflected Victorian bodies. Medicine became the language through which society expressed its panic. Panic about changing gender roles. Panic about sexuality. Panic about desire itself. And those fears would shape treatments that were about to get even more invasive and far more devastating. If Victorian medicine had a crown jewel, the diagnosis it polished, displayed, and proudly misused, it was hysteria. No condition in history has been diagnosed so often with so little actual evidence. It was vague, elastic, and absolutely everywhere. It covered hundreds of supposed symptoms, yet none of them pointed to a real disease. It was the perfect medical invention. Dramatic enough to justify wild treatments, broad enough to apply to nearly anyone, and moral enough to reinforce every Victorian idea about what a woman should be. Doctors described hysteria with the enthusiasm of collectors cataloging rare butterflies. Symptoms included fainting, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, spontaneous weeping, daydreaming, a tendency toward rebellion, a desire for independence, and, most suspiciously of all, excessive sexual feeling. In other words, hysteria was everything Victorian society feared about women, wrapped up in one convenient label. And because hysteria could mean whatever a doctor decided it meant, its diagnosis skyrocketed. Middle-class women, married women, unmarried women, women who worked too much, women who worked too little. Nearly every type of woman was considered vulnerable. Meanwhile, men could suffer the exact same symptoms and simply be described as tired or nervous. Part of hysteria's power came from its fake scientific aura. Victorian physicians loved the prestige of medical language, so they borrowed from ancient, disproven theories. The old Greek idea that a woman's uterus could wander around her body causing trouble, a bit of medical nonsense even classical writers joked about, resurfaced in Victorian textbooks with a totally straight face. Doctors earnestly insisted the female reproductive system was unstable, unpredictable, and capable of causing emotional chaos if not properly controlled. The truth was far simpler. Hysteria was a socially acceptable way to dismiss women's suffering, silence their frustrations, and pathologize their desires. If a woman was overwhelmed by the suffocating demands of domestic life, she was hysterical. If she was furious about her lack of legal rights, she was hysterical. If she experienced sexual longing or, worse, sexual dissatisfaction, she was hysterical. Hysteria was both the diagnosis and the warning label. And so the treatments weren't prescribed to heal, but to discipline. Sedatives to quiet thoughts. Ice baths to cool impulses. Rest cures to immobilize the body. Isolation to curb agitation. All of it was designed to restore the patient to the ideal Victorian woman. Quiet, compliant, and unquestioning. Hysteria wasn't medicine. It was a culturally approved eraser, wiping away women's voices while pretending to care for their health. And in many cases, the so-called cure would become far more damaging than the disease ever was. Of all the treatments Victorian medicine inflicted on women, none was as infamous or as quietly devastating as the rest cure. Developed by the star neurologist Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the rest cure was advertised as a revolutionary treatment for hysteria, nervousness, female weakness, and any symptom that even vaguely resembled unhappiness. In practice, it was psychological imprisonment wrapped in medical respectability. The rest cure prescribed one thing above all else: total inactivity. Patients were confined to bed for weeks, sometimes even months. They were forbidden from reading, writing, thinking hard, walking, getting fresh air, having visitors, or doing anything that might stimulate their minds. Essentially, if it brought joy, exercise, or the slightest mental activity, it was banned. Women were expected to lie perfectly still and let their bodies rebuild their nerves, as if the human soul were a broken teacup that just needed to sit on a shelf for a while. Doctors believed this enforced rest restored feminine delicacy. In reality, it eroded mental stability. Healthy people would suffer under such isolation, but many patients weren't healthy to begin with. They came into treatment depressed, anxious, or overwhelmed by the narrow confines of domestic life. The rest cure amplified every symptom by stripping them of all autonomy. Some women described feeling like prisoners in their own bedrooms. Others wrote later that they felt their very identities dissolving day by day into the silence. Food was also controlled. Patients were forced to consume heavy, rich diets to restore vitality, sometimes being fed by nurses as if they were infants. Massage and mild electrotherapy were performed daily, not for comfort, but because doctors believed inactivity caused muscles to decay. The result was a bizarre, infantilizing routine: eat, be massaged, lie still, obey. The more a woman resisted, the more her resistance was seen as proof that she needed the treatment. The most famous account of the rest cure's damage is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Gilman herself underwent Mitchell's treatment, was forbidden to write, and nearly lost her mind. Her story is a chilling, fictionalized account of a woman slowly unraveling as isolation becomes madness. A story rooted in horrifying reality. But the deeper cruelty of the rest cure was this: it treated a woman's pain as evidence of her unfitness, her thoughts as symptoms, her creativity as danger, her desires as disorder. It was Victorian morality disguised as medicine, punishing women for outgrowing the tiny role society had assigned to them. It did not cure their suffering. It silenced it, and in that silence, many women broke. If Victorian medicine had a final threat, the shadow lurking behind every prescription and whispered warning, it was the asylum. These institutions were presented as havens of scientific treatment and compassionate care. But in reality, they often functioned as moral storage rooms, places where inconvenient women could be tucked away with full medical justification. A husband, a father, even a brother could request a woman's commitment with breathtaking ease. And once inside the asylum walls, she might never see freedom again. Victorian asylums operated on a chilling principle. If a woman could not perform proper femininity, she was mentally unwell. And proper femininity meant obedience, calmness, modesty, and an astonishing tolerance for boredom. A woman who challenged her husband, refused her duties, sought education, or displayed sexual autonomy could be labeled with a variety of alarming diagnoses: moral insanity, erotomania, melancholic excitability, or the all-purpose favorite, hysteria. Once that diagnosis was written, no further evidence was needed. Medical authority became a cage. Conditions inside varied, but many were bleak. Overcrowded wards, poor sanitation, and high mortality rates were common. Treatments included cold water immersion, forced feeding, isolation in padded cells, more electrotherapy, and sedatives that dulled far more than distress. Even simple human acts, crying, pacing, refusing food, were recorded not as reactions to imprisonment, but as proof of the illness. Every behavior became self-confirming evidence that the patient belonged there. But the most disturbing part wasn't the brutality. It was how ordinary the justifications were. A woman grieving too intensely after a death could be committed. A woman who read too much poetry could be committed. A woman who expressed romantic desire or refused marital relations could be committed. The asylum system blurred the line between medicine and morality until the two were indistinguishable. Some women genuinely suffered from severe mental illness, of course, but Victorian treatments rarely helped them. Others were entirely sane. Their incarceration was motivated by family conflict, property disputes, or the inconvenient timing of their emotions. The asylum became the ultimate silencing mechanism. The great irony? Male patients with similar behaviors were often treated differently. Men who drank, gambled, or were promiscuous might be called passionate or high-spirited. Women with those same impulses were degenerates. In the Victorian asylum, science claimed neutrality, but morality held the keys. And behind those locked doors, countless women disappeared into diagnoses that reflected not their own minds, but society's deepest fears. The end of the line. If this series is opening your eyes to this dark chapter, hitting subscribe helps bring more hidden histories to light. Next, we look at the chemical method of control: sedation. If the asylum was the cage, then sedation was the lock. A chemical method of quieting women whose emotions or desires made Victorian society deeply uncomfortable. 19th century doctors had an astonishing enthusiasm for drugs that dulled consciousness. Opium, laudanum, chloral hydrate, bromides, ether. Substances that today would require extreme caution were handed out like candy. She is troublesome. Read one typical medical note. Increase her laudanum. The solution to distress wasn't understanding or support. It was absorption into a chemical fog. Sedation was often the first treatment offered for hysteria, anxiety, grief, excessive sexual desire, or simply for refusing to smile on command. Victorians treated emotions like medical fires. If a woman burned too brightly, the goal was to extinguish her. And so, women were routinely lulled into half-conscious states where they could neither protest nor participate in their own lives. Doctors insisted this was healing, that sedation calmed the nerves, soothed the spirit, and restored feminine gentleness. In reality, it kept women compliant and manageable. Laudanum was the era's superstar drug, a potent mixture of alcohol and opium. It was sold in stores, recommended by doctors, and consumed by mothers, daughters, and even given to fussy infants. It eased pain, yes, but it also erased restlessness, frustration, anger, and desire, all emotions Victorian society deemed unseemly in women. Many became dependent without anyone recognizing it as addiction. After all, dependency looked very similar to the ideal Victorian woman. Quiet, passive, pliant. Chloral hydrate, known as knockout drops, was another favorite. It was prescribed for insomnia, hysteria, nighttime excitability, and even moral agitation, a phrase that essentially meant she has opinions. The drug induced deep, sometimes dangerously deep sleep, and long-term use caused confusion, memory loss, and emotional flattening. Doctors noticed the side effects, but not enough to stop prescribing it. A silent patient was easier to manage than a suffering one. What made these treatments particularly cruel was that they were framed as acts of compassion. A physician might gently tell a woman, "You must rest, your nerves are overwrought," and then administer a dose strong enough to obliterate her will. Family members believed they were helping. Communities believed medicine was advancing. And women slowly disappeared into sedation, their personalities dissolving under the weight of drugs they were told would make them well. Victorian sedation wasn't treatment. It was erasure, not of illness, but of inconvenience, not of symptoms, but of women's voices. And beneath the quiet surface lay a profound, terrible truth. Silence, not health, was the real prescription. No aspect of Victorian medicine reveals its moral agenda more clearly than the way it treated female desire. To a 19th century doctor, a woman's sexuality was not a part of her humanity. It was a threat, a destabilizing force, a potential gateway to moral collapse, social decay, and what physicians gravely called degenerative tendencies. So instead of acknowledging female desire as natural, Victorian medicine pathologized it. A woman who wanted intimacy was not passionate. She was overstimulated. A woman dissatisfied in her marriage was not neglected. She was disordered. Sexual desire in a woman was treated as a medical emergency. Doctors described female pleasure with near-apocalyptic language. Medical journals warned that excessive passion could cause insanity, infertility, spinal collapse, or even death. Some claimed a woman's body could not physically withstand pleasure without long-term damage. A theory based on cultural panic, not anatomy. The fear was so intense that doctors treated it with the seriousness of a contagious disease. The diagnosis most often applied was nymphomania, a term that covered everything from a healthy libido to perfectly normal curiosity. Symptoms included excessive interest in romance, frequent daydreaming, difficulty remaining modest, and inappropriate affection toward one's husband. Yes, enjoying marital intimacy could be a red flag. Doctors interpreted desire not as an emotion, but as a breakdown of feminine virtue, evidence that a woman's moral center was failing. The treatments were as alarming as the diagnosis. Some women were subjected to forced isolation to cool their passions. Others were prescribed ice baths, sedation, or physical restraints. In the most extreme and disturbing cases, doctors performed clitoridectomies, the surgical removal of the clitoris, believing it would extinguish desire permanently. These procedures were justified as medical necessity, but they were acts of violence committed under the banner of science. And yet, in a bizarre and hypocritical twist, the same medical world that feared female desire also invented the pelvic massage, a treatment used by some physicians to relieve hysteria by manually inducing what we now recognize as an orgasm. Doctors believed this was purely clinical and not sexual, because Victorian morality allowed men to produce pleasure as long as they insisted they didn't understand it. Victorian medicine's approach to desire exposed a deep cultural terror, the fear that women, if allowed autonomy over their bodies, might demand autonomy in every other part of life. So sexuality became pathology, pleasure became disease, and the female body became a battlefield between morality and control. For all its obsession with imaginary illnesses, Victorian medicine often failed catastrophically when a woman's suffering was real. Genuine medical conditions, endometriosis, postpartum depression, chronic pain, infections, autoimmune disorders, were routinely dismissed as female nerves or moral weakness. The irony was brutal. The same society that diagnosed women for simply having emotions refused to diagnose them when they were genuinely physically ill. A woman experiencing crippling menstrual pain might be told she was exaggerating. A woman with chronic fatigue was lazy. A woman suffering complications after childbirth was hysterical instead of being treated. Victorian doctors wrote confidently about the female body, yet their knowledge was shockingly incomplete. Women's anatomy was rarely studied. Women's symptoms were rarely believed. Pain was interpreted through a lens of morality. If a woman hurt, it was often assumed she had caused it through impropriety, anxiety, or insufficient obedience. One of the most tragic examples was postpartum depression, which Victorian physicians almost universally misinterpreted as puerperal insanity. Women experiencing trauma after childbirth were isolated, sedated, and sometimes institutionalized. Instead of receiving compassion, they were given cold baths and more lectures. Their emotional collapse was seen not as a response to hormonal shifts and exhaustion, but as evidence of a failure in feminine duty. Diseases like endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome didn't have names yet. They existed painfully relentlessly, but doctors lacked both the research and, too often, the interest to understand them. When women reported symptoms, physicians dismissed them as exaggerations or attention-seeking. Medical texts frequently described women as naturally inclined toward theatrical suffering. Their pain was treated as unreliable, even when it pointed to life-threatening conditions. Even tuberculosis, one of the deadliest diseases of the era, was romanticized when it affected women. Pale skin, thin bodies, and weakness became the aesthetic of the consumptive beauty. Real suffering was turned into a fashion trend. Women were praised for looking sick, then blamed when they died. Medical research itself reflected the bias. Experiments were conducted primarily on men. Treatments were based on male physiology. Women were seen not as full subjects, but as variations, weaker, more fragile, morally unpredictable. This meant women's illnesses were often invisible in medical literature. If a symptom didn't fit the male model, it was pathologized, dismissed, or ignored. Victorian medicine was dangerous not only because it invented diseases, but because it refused to see the real ones. And in the silence created by that disbelief, countless women suffered without names for their pain, and without hope for a cure. Alright, epic history fans, we're traveling way back now, leaving the stuffy Victorian parlors for the sun-baked hills of ancient Macedonia. We're about to trace the footsteps of a boy who would become a legend, Alexander the Great. And it all starts not with a bang, but in a palace already trembling with ambition. If you're ready for a story of destiny, drama, and world-conquering ambition, you're in the right place. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. It's how you make sure you don't miss a single chapter of this incredible life. Alexander entered the world not quietly, but into a palace buzzing with the energy of a rising power. His father, King Philip II of Macedon, was a force of nature, a man who reshaped kingdoms the way a blacksmith reshapes iron. He'd taken a backward, fractured Macedonia and forged it into a military titan. His mother, Olympias, was no less formidable. Intense, mystical, and fiercely devoted to her son. She told young Alexander he was descended from the hero Achilles, and she said it with the absolute confidence of a woman who expected the world to agree. From day one, Alexander lived in a home where power was the first language. Generals marched through the halls like moving statues of leather and bronze. Diplomats bowed low, unsure whether they feared Philip or admired him more. Even the servants whispered about omens, victories, and prophecies. Alexander absorbed it all. While other kids played with toys, he studied the hardened faces of veterans returning from battle. His teachers quickly realized this boy wasn't normal. He asked too many questions. Sharp, unsettling questions. When told a myth, he demanded the political lesson behind it. When told a battle story, he wanted to know about the terrain, the formations, the mistakes. He learned to read fast, but it was Homer's Iliad that became his obsession. Achilles became his imaginary companion, his silent rival, his unreachable standard. He slept with a copy under his pillow and treated the text like holy scripture. By age 10, Alexander was already showing the iron core of his personality. The famous story of Bucephalus, the massive, wild black stallion, proves it. Philip had bought the horse, but no one could tame it. The animal reared and kicked, terrifying every grown man. But Alexander noticed something others missed. The horse was spooked by its own shadow. The boy calmly led Bucephalus to face the sun, climbed on his back, and rode him as if they were old friends. Philip watched, stunned. He said to have told his son, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." That moment became legend. But for Alexander, it was just confirmation. He wasn't meant for comfort or ordinary paths. He was a boy raised on war stories and destiny, already imagining an empire long before he could grow a beard. The making of a legend begins. If you're excited to follow Alexander's journey, make sure you're subscribed. Next, we meet the man who would shape his mind, the philosopher Aristotle. So the legend of Alexander was born with a boy and a horse. But a future king needs more than writing skills. He needs a mind. And Philip II, always thinking 10 steps ahead, knew his extraordinary son needed the most extraordinary teacher alive. So he sent for a man from the quiet hills of Stagira, Aristotle. This wasn't just hiring a tutor. This was like trying to capture lightning in a bottle to power your kid's brain. Aristotle was the intellectual rock star of the age. Philosopher, scientist, student of Plato, the guy who basically wrote the book on everything. Bringing him to Macedonia was a power move that shook up the whole Greek world. At first, Alexander wasn't thrilled. He probably expected another grizzled old soldier to teach him more about swords and spears. Instead, he got a calm man in a simple cloak, carrying scrolls instead of shields. But Aristotle's weapon was knowledge, and he wielded it like a razor-sharp blade. On their very first day, he hit Alexander with a question the boy had never considered. Is it better to conquer the world, or to understand it? Alexander was stunned. He didn't know there was a difference. To him, conquering was understanding. Aristotle set up his school in the peaceful groves of Mysa, far from the noisy palace intrigue. It was a sanctuary of shade, stone, and serious thought. Here, Alexander and a hand-picked group of young nobles, future generals and kings in their own right, were pulled from the drill fields and plunged into a world of ideas. Their days weren't filled with battle drills, but with debates. Ethics, biology, politics, poetry, logic. Alexander dissected animals to learn anatomy. He charted stars to learn astronomy. He argued about justice and the nature of the soul. Under Aristotle, he learned that ruling required more than force. It required wisdom. The most important text? Still Homer's Iliad. But Aristotle didn't let Alexander just idolize Achilles. He made him analyze him. Courage, Aristotle warned, is not recklessness. A great king must be brave, but he must also be wise. Alexander listened, though maybe not as carefully as his teacher hoped. He was also learning the principles of leadership, persuasion, and statecraft, lessons that would one day shape how he governed the largest empire the world had ever seen. But beneath all the philosophy, something else was cooking. Ambition, now refined and sharpened by intellect. Alexander started to see patterns in history, in how empires rose and fell. The world became a complex puzzle, and he was determined to solve it by any means necessary. Aristotle didn't try to crush Alexander's hunger for glory. He tried to discipline it, to give it direction, to marry the mind of a philosopher with the heart of a conqueror. By the time their lessons ended, Aristotle had done what no army could. He had forged Alexander's restless, fiery ambition into a theory of greatness. The sword would come later, but the mind, the relentless, curious, brilliant mind, was shaped right here, in this quiet garden. Aristotle might have been shaping Alexander's mind, but the environment at Mysa was shaping his future army. This wasn't just a classroom. It was a training ground for a brotherhood. The boys who studied under those shaded trees weren't just classmates. They were the future commanders, governors, and bodyguards of an empire. Here, lifelong friendships and fierce rivalries were forged in the same fire. Let's meet the crew, the guys who would one day be known as Alexander's companions. Hephaestion, the quiet one. Thoughtful, steady, and fiercely loyal. He would become Alexander's closest friend, his confidant, the one person who could calm the storms in the prince's soul. Their bond was the stuff of legend. Ptolemy, observant and clever, he watched everything and remembered it all. He'd later become a general, a king of Egypt, and write a history of their campaigns. That, conveniently, always made him look good. Cassander, tense, calculating, and deeply ambitious. He watched Alexander with a mix of envy and resentment. Their rivalry would one day turn bloody. Seleucus, big, strong, and serious. He carried himself like a born leader because he'd eventually carve out his own massive kingdom in Asia. Lysimachus, a rugged, bold bruiser. He loved physical challenges and often tested Alexander, wrestling or racing him, pushing the prince to his limits. Aristotle treated them like young philosophers, not soldiers. Lessons happened cross-legged on the grass. A king, he'd tell them, is only a man who persuades others he is worth following. Alexander took this to heart, comparing it to his father's belief that a king was simply the man with the strongest army. Somewhere between those two ideas, Alexander started crafting his own style of leadership. But it wasn't all scrolls and deep thoughts. Between lessons, these future kings and generals were still teenagers. They'd wrestle, race, climb trees, and play brutal, chaotic games that were basically military drills in disguise. Their competitions were fierce. Who could recite the most Homer? Who could run the fastest? Who could argue Aristotle into a corner using his own logic? Alexander rarely lost, and when he did, he never forgot it. Disagreements sometimes turned into shoving matches or wrestling holds, but Aristotle encouraged debate. He believed conflict sharpened the mind. In Alexander's case, it also sharpened his ambition. He learned not just how to win an argument, but how to win loyalty. Even as a teen, he had that magnetic pull, that force that made others want to follow him into the unknown. While the other boys dreamed of estates and local glory, Alexander dreamed on a different scale. He interpreted every lesson, math, poetry, biology, through one lens: conquest. If Aristotle explained how the world worked, Alexander immediately wondered how he could unify it. Mysa wasn't just a school. It was the seedbed of an empire, and Alexander was already tilling the soil. While Aristotle was sharpening Alexander's mind, King Philip II was hardening his son's body. Macedonia wasn't a place for soft, philosophical princes. It was a warrior kingdom. Its hills echoed with the sounds of drilling troops and hammering iron. Boys became soldiers young, and Alexander, the heir, was expected to become the best of them all. Training began before dawn, while mist still clung to the fields. Alexander would join his unit for riding drills that lasted hours, spear practice until his arms burned, and long, grueling marches that tested endurance more than strength. Macedonian nobles didn't command from the rear. They fought in the front lines. Alexander had to be as tough as the men he would one day lead. He learned to handle the sarissa, the ridiculously long Macedonian pike, a weapon that required incredible strength and coordination just to hold, let alone fight with. He practiced with the sword and the shield, mastering the brutal, efficient movements that meant the difference between life and death in the crush of a phalanx. This wasn't just gym class. It was cultural conditioning. Macedonia glorified physical toughness. Royalty wasn't exempt. Philip believed his son needed to sweat, bleed, and ache alongside the common soldiers. He'd often surprise Alexander's unit with punishing, unexpected drills, forcing them to climb sheer hillsides, cross icy rivers, or march for days with minimal sleep. He wanted Alexander to know discomfort, exhaustion, and fear, and to conquer each one. Alexander never complained. He was driven by something deeper, a burning need to outshine every man, including his own father. When other boys collapsed at the end of a march, Alexander kept walking. When a horse threw him, he demanded to get right back on. Bruises and cuts weren't injuries. They were badges of honor. Even Philip noticed his son trained with a terrifying, focused intensity, like he was preparing for battles that were still decades in the future. But the physical training also fueled Alexander's imagination. Galloping across the Macedonian plains, he wasn't just on a horse. He was leading a cavalry charge across the plains of Persia. Practicing swordplay, he wasn't fighting a training post. He was dueling a Persian immortal. On those long, silent marches, he'd recite lines from the Iliad under his breath, mentally placing himself on the plains of Troy beside Achilles. His childhood myths were merging with his brutal reality. He was also learning the unbreakable rhythms of command, the importance of formation, the logistics of supply, the loyalty that forms between soldiers who suffer together. He wasn't just building muscle. He was building the unshakable foundation of a commander. Every ache, every drop of sweat, was preparing him for the world he intended to take. Macedonia was training a prince, but Alexander was training himself to become a myth. For most kids, mythology is just a bunch of fun stories about gods and monsters. For Alexander, it was his family tree. His entire world was steeped in the belief, whispered by his mother Olympias, echoed by priests, that he was descended from heroes. From Achilles on his mother's side, and from Heracles on his father's. True or not, Alexander believed it with every fiber of his being. To him, myths weren't fiction. They were a blueprint for his life. Olympias was the head curator of this belief. She cultivated it with theatrical, mystical devotion, burning incense, consulting oracles, surrounding Alexander with symbols of divine heroes. She didn't tell him tales of Achilles' speed and Heracles' strength as legends. She told them as reminders of the blood that supposedly flowed in his own veins. She wanted him to be extraordinary, and she knew the surest way to bind a boy to greatness was to convince him he was born for it. Alexander soaked it all up. He treated Homer's Iliad not as great poetry, but as a personal prophecy. He memorized passages about honor, destiny, and glorious death, imagining himself on the dusty plains of Troy. Achilles became his ultimate model, unbeatable in battle, uncompromising in pride, unmatched in glory. But the myth also taught him a dangerous lesson, that greatness often walks hand in hand with rage, loneliness, and a crushing burden of expectation. Meanwhile, his father Philip reinforced the other side of the lineage. Heracles, the hero who earned his place through sheer labor and struggle. Philip, a practical, hardened man, never spoke with Olympias's mystical flair. He embodied the message physically. Greatness, he showed Alexander, is earned in sweat and blood long before it's celebrated in song. He wanted his son to believe in discipline, not just divine right. As Alexander grew, these two powerful influences collided inside him. His mother's mystical fire and his father's practical steel. He began to see himself as a bridge between worlds, part mortal prince, part mythic heir. Every victory in training felt like a confirmation from the gods. Every failure felt like a betrayal of his destiny. And then Aristotle added a third, crucial voice, urging Alexander to see heroes not just as warriors, but as moral figures capable of virtue or ruin. Achilles was great, the philosopher warned, but he was not always wise. His rage destroyed his friend and nearly cost the Greeks the war. Alexander listened to all three: mother, father, teacher, and in the depths of his ambitious soul, he forged a belief that would define his entire life. He was destined for unimaginable greatness, but he would have to seize every inch of it himself. The gods might have given him the lineage, but the glory would be his to earn or to lose. Studying under Aristotle and training in the hills was one thing. But in Macedonia, a prince's education wasn't complete without the smell of smoke, the sound of clashing metal, and the sight of real battle. War wasn't a distant concept for Alexander, it was the family business. And as a teenager, he got a front-row seat to its brutal realities. Philip often brought his son to military councils. The air in those rooms was thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and ambition. Grizzled generals would lean over maps scratched in wax, arguing over terrain, tribal politics, and supply lines. Alexander learned to observe quietly at first, absorbing strategies like a sponge. But it wasn't long before the brilliant, arrogant teen started offering his own opinions. Bold ones. Philip would raise an eyebrow, sometimes amused, sometimes annoyed, but secretly impressed by his son's sharp, tactical mind. War wasn't just discussed, it was practiced. Macedonia was constantly fighting to secure its borders, skirmishing with tribes like the Illyrians and Thracians. Philip let Alexander accompany him on troop inspections, where the boy watched the terrifying precision of the Macedonian phalanx, a forest of 18-foot sarissas moving as one. He learned that an army's strength wasn't just in its weapons, but in the iron discipline and absolute trust between its men. And trust, Alexander learned, required presence. He didn't act like a prince who commanded from a distance. He walked among the soldiers, asked them questions, even joined their training drills when Philip wasn't looking. The troops noticed. They respected a boy who was willing to sweat and strain beside them far more than a noble who just shouted orders. But Alexander's education in command also involved lessons in fear. Philip intentionally exposed him to the ugly aftermath of battle. Broken shields, the groans of the wounded, the solemn funerals for the fallen. He wanted his son to see the true cost of victory before he ever led a charge. Instead of scaring him, it deepened Alexander's resolve. If empire building demanded sacrifice, he wanted to understand the price in full. This exposure also awakened a darker, more dangerous part of Alexander's ambition. He became fascinated with how a single, decisive battle could shatter an enemy's will and alter the fate of nations. To him, war wasn't just destruction. It was the ultimate tool of transformation, a way to hammer the chaotic world into the shape he dreamed of. By his mid-teens, Alexander no longer dreamed of glory in abstract terms. He saw it as something crafted through perfect strategy, relentless discipline, and breathtaking courage. He wasn't just learning how to fight. He was learning how to lead men into the mouth of hell and make them believe it was paradise. For all his training in war and philosophy, nothing schooled young Alexander in survival more than the volatile, scheming environment of the Macedonian court at Pella. If the battlefield taught him courage, the palace taught him paranoia. It was a snake pit of ambition, jealousy, and alliances so fragile they could shatter with a single whispered rumor. Philip II was a brilliant king, but his court was a storm of his own making. His marriages were political weapons, and each new wife brought new factions, new half-siblings, and new rivals under one roof. Alexander grew up surrounded by people who smiled to his face while plotting behind tapestries. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone watched the heir. His mother, Olympias, fiercely protective and politically savvy, was his constant guide through this maze. Trust no one who smiles too easily, she'd warn him. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival advice. The court saw Alexander not just as a prince, but as an obstacle or a pawn. His intelligence and charisma inspired loyalty in some, but fear and bitter envy in others. Older generals might respect him. Younger nobles definitely envied him. Some hoped to control him. Others wouldn't have minded if he simply disappeared. Alexander learned, quickly and painfully, that a king's son must master the art of listening more than he speaks. He studied body language and subtle insults the way Aristotle taught him to study logic. He noticed who avoided his gaze, who flattered him too thickly, who praised his father but never him. Even foreign powers watched him closely. Envoys from Athens, Thebes, and Sparta would scrutinize the Macedonian prince during ceremonies, trying to gauge whether he was a future threat or just a spirited boy playing dress-up. Alexander learned to stand unervingly still, speak with calculated clarity, and project the poise of a man twice his age. Behind the courtly dances and diplomatic dinners, the tension between Alexander and his father grew more complex. Philip saw in his son a terrifying reflection of his own brilliance and ambition. The pride was there, but so was a flicker of unease. The student was threatening to surpass the teacher. Caught between his mother's whispers of divine destiny and his father's lessons in realpolitik, Alexander learned the hardest truth of kingship. It required both the unshakable confidence of a god and the cunning of a street fighter. Pella was his first real battlefield. Intrigue was his first weapon. Survival was his first test. Long before he ever drew a sword against a foreign enemy, Alexander the Great learned how to navigate a world where loyalty was a currency, betrayal was always on the menu, and every single gesture carried the weight of a political statement. All the studying, all the training, all the palace intrigue, it was all leading to this moment. Alexander didn't have to wait long for theory to become reality. While Philip was away on a crucial diplomatic mission, a rebellion exploded among the Mede, a Thracian tribe to the north. The kingdom needed a steady hand. Philip, in a move that stunned the court, decided that hand belonged to his 16-year-old son. The announcement caused an uproar. Skeptical nobles muttered that Philip had lost his mind. Alexander was brilliant, yes, but he was still a boy. Putting him in command against hardened mountain warriors was a risk no seasoned king should take. But Philip didn't hesitate. This was the final exam. He needed to know if all the philosophy, all the drills, all the ambition had forged something that could hold under the crushing pressure of real command. Alexander seized the opportunity with a cold, focused excitement. Donning armor that was still a bit too large for him, he led the Macedonian cavalry north. He was accompanied by a group of veteran officers who, let's be honest, probably expected to have to rescue the kid prince when things went south. They didn't know him yet. Alexander didn't charge in recklessly. He acted like a general. He studied the rugged terrain, questioned local scouts relentlessly, and planned his movements with a strategic clarity that shocked his seasoned advisors. When the Mede tried to launch a surprise attack, Alexander struck first. He launched a lightning-fast cavalry charge on their exposed flank, scattering them before they even knew what was happening. Veterans who were there reported later that the young prince moved, as if the gods whispered in his ear. In truth, it was years of absorbing Philip's tactics, sharpened by Aristotle's logic, and ignited by Alexander's own desperate need to prove himself. The victory was swift and total. By the time King Philip returned to Pella, he found the northern border secure, the rebellion crushed, and his son being carried on the shoulders of soldiers who now adored him. Alexander had fought at the front, shared their hardships, and displayed a courage that walked the line between brilliant and insane. Philip said nothing in public, but privately, according to court rumors, he admitted, "My son seeks a kingdom worthy of him. Macedonia is too small." The nobles who had scoffed now looked at Alexander with a new, uneasy respect. For the first time, Macedonia had seen a glimpse of the hurricane that was coming. And Alexander, he had tasted something more intoxicating than wine. The pure, addicting thrill of total command. And he was hungry for more. The first victory and the point of no return. If you're on the edge of your seat, your subscription fuels this deep dive. Next, we see the cracks forming as the prince becomes a power in his own right. See you then.